Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have a full room here in the Charlemagne building. I hope we have also many participants online joining us for this last session of the morning, focusing on renewable energy projects and how to speed up their deployment. We will mainly be looking at public acceptance of renewable energy projects and avoiding conflicts with other users of land and sea space, as this is the main factor for speeding up the deployment of renewable energy projects. We will be using Slido during this session. You should be able now to see on the screen the instructions how to join Slido online and ask all your questions. We have a little poll prepared for you to answer. And afterwards we will see the results and then start with the open questions during the panel discussion. But first, I am pleased to have our Deputy Director General of DG Energy here with us. This morning, Mechthild, you will set the scene for our discussion, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vera, and still good morning to everyone, and very pleased to be here on that important session on how to speed up renewables. I think if there's one thing we are all clear about is the top priority to have more renewables faster, not only already before the crisis, but right now I think it's one of the key ways out, and we have to discuss today, and I'm very happy to have such a nice panel here that we go through what are the main obstacles. And we have at the EU level a very ambitious target. We want to achieve 45% renewables by 2030. It's still a proposal by the Commission, so we have to negotiate with our European Parliament, members of Parliament and European Council. We will start to do so next week. So we start with the so-called trilogues, the negotiations between the two institutions next week. And then we will see how it goes, and hopefully under Czech presidency, we can reach an ambitious agreement. Hand in hand with renewables, I always have to underline, is energy efficiency. So always we have also an ambitious target and negotiations in parallel to reach at least 13% energy efficiency target by 2030. We have a lot of renewables, different kind of renewables. The EU came out with a strategy on solar energy, and this is one of the priorities in the renewable sector, that we would like to double solar photovoltaic capacity in the next couple of years and to trigger a quick but also massive PV deployment also via our solar rooftop initiative. This is something we don't need to wait. I think everyone can start to do it, and that could accelerate a couple of things we need to do. As we know, when we speak about accelerating renewables, one of the key issues is permitting procedures and also more generally administrative procedures. And here it's clear that there are EU rules, but there are also national and regional and sometimes local rules which make it slower to really get the renewables project done. And the complexity of these applicable rules for the site selection, but also the authorizations for projects. Sometimes it's the grid connection issues, because we don't only need the renewables, but we need often to connect them. Sometimes there are constraints on adapting technology specification. And last but not least, we know that the administrations are also facing sometimes staff issues. So have enough capacity locally, regionally, nationally to really go through the permit granting, and the authorities need the right people there as well. We know, as I mentioned also this morning, we know it can take up to 10 years, even more, for a renewable project to get online. Often offshore wind projects in the past have been quite long, onshore wind as well, others a bit shorter, but far too long in the current context. And that's why we have been looking at it since long. It's already in the existing renewable directive, where we made proposal to accelerate, have one-stop shops, and so on. But with the Repower EU package this year, we have two main instruments on that issue. And I would really underline the two, because I think both are really important, because the first one is the guidance on speeding up permit granting procedures and facilitate PPAs. So power purchase agreements, which are still relatively few in Europe compared, for example, to the US or other parts in the world. So we want to encourage the member states to take steps already now. They don't need to wait for any new proposal from the Commission or this negotiations in the Parliament, but to go as quickly as possible with the existing framework. And then, as I said, we have proposed modification in the current provisions in our legislation to aim to even further speed up. And what is important that we carry out, or member states more, carry out strategic planning for renewable projects. They all have their national energy and climate plans. That's all member states have done in view of 2030. So every member states have renewables targets. Every member states need to set up a planning. And for us, this is interesting because it should also map the areas with good potential necessary for meeting the national contribution. And as part of that exercise, we invite member states to look at so-called go-to areas. These are particularly suitable for the deployment of renewable. It can be for wind, it can be for solar, it can be for a combination of both or others. So member states and our Joint Research Center can help in mapping these areas, because that could mean an industrial site or former industrial site or other transport infrastructures around, or degraded land not usable for agriculture, where they are particularly suitable. And then we do one impact assessment on environment, strategic environment impact assessment, and then we are faster in doing project by project. This is for the go-to areas. That we propose also that we shorten the deadlines for renewable projects permitting, not only in the go-to areas. Let me underline that as well. Everywhere in Europe, we want to shorten the deadlines. In the go-to areas, we propose a 1-year deadline for new projects and 6 months for repowering, so meaning repowering existing projects. And that is, as I explained before, under the presumption that these go-to areas don't have significant environmental impacts as such, and so the screening of the projects can go faster. Outside and everywhere else, we propose 2 years for new projects and 1 year for repowering, including the specific environmental impact assessment. So this is a kind of balance between really taking care of environmental assessment, but also go ahead with renewables projects. Another key proposal in our discussion right now is really that the production of energy from renewable sources, but also the connection to the grid, the related grid itself and the storage asset are of overriding public interest because they serve public health and safety. And I would also integrate, they help to get affordable energy prices in the future, becoming less dependent from third countries, and do something good for climate. So there's a really need to recognize these important role with the overriding public interest. And a fourth example of how we can accelerate permitting, we have coming out all these in our guidance and recommendation, but I would like to underline one additional change that will contribute to shorten the deadlines. That is what we call positive administrative silence in go-to areas, meaning if there's no reaction, we take it as a yes, and then we can go ahead. So, as I mentioned, these are our key new legislative proposals as part of Repower EU. We are quite happy that Parliament and Council take them on board in the trialogues, which start next week. So they will take them on board in the running of the trialogues. And with the Czech presidency, we hope to find a good and ambitious agreement. But let's not wait for that. There are many things we can do now. As I said, the current framework can already do a lot to shorten and be really much faster in deployment of renewables in your organization with the help of us for cross-border, but also a lot in the local and regional and national. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. My colleague will moderate. We have an excellent panel here. We have a room full of experts, and I hope also online. So I'm looking forward to interesting discussions right now. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Mechthild, for giving us the overview of the actions that the Commission has taken to tackle the various barriers which exist in speeding up permit granting for renewable energy projects, and in particular for stressing that there are many things that can already be done today, which have been picked up by the Commission in the guidance and recommendation, along with the legislative proposal that has been presented in May. I would now like to see if we have already some results on the Slido poll, which we launched. Or, yes? Yes. So the question was, from which country are you joining us today? I see that we have a variety of countries. Netherlands, Poland, Spain seem to be the leading ones. Germany, Belgium, and France, I see. Let's leave it open for a little bit, and then we will go, also UK, not only EU countries. Yeah, it's always nice to see where the audience is from, and like this, you're familiar with this tool and can start asking your questions afterwards. I will now introduce the panel. We have here with us today Carlos Martin. You are the CEO of Blue Float Energy, an international offshore wind energy development company. You have worked in the energy sector for more than 15 years, amongst others as project director at EDP Renewables, based in Madrid. And you were responsible for overseeing the development of the Wind Float Atlantic project for that company. Carlos is a trained engineer, and he is teaching business strategy at the IE Business School in Madrid. Thank you for coming. Then we have Milou van Moerik. You are a senior policy advisor for climate and energy at the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy since 2018. Prior to that, you worked at the Ministry of the Interior on International Urban Planning Affairs and at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment. Milou is a trained political scientist and holds a Master in Public Administration from the University of Leiden. Thank you also for coming to be with us today. And finally, our third panelist is Dragana Milosnic. I hope the pronunciation is more or less okay. You are Southeast Europe Program Director at the Nature Conservancy Europe. The Nature Conservancy is a global environmental organization headquartered in the US. Dragana leads a conservation program in Southeast Europe focused on solutions that tackle both climate and biodiversity challenges, including by identifying suitable locations for solar and wind energy. So this is very topical for our discussion today. Dragana has previously worked for 10 years in the civil society sector in Brussels and holds a master's degree in environmental change and management from the University of Oxford. Thank you also for coming. So we will now go to an introductory round of presentations by our three speakers. I will invite as first speaker Carlos Martin to present the project he's currently working on.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this very interesting panel. I would also like to start by praising the role that the European Commission is playing in pushing renewables forward in Europe, and highlight that in my previous experience that you were mentioning, Wind Float Atlantic, it became a reality. It's one of the 3 existing floating wind projects that are operational worldwide. It existed thanks to the support from the EU through the NE 300 project. So I would like to talk today about public acceptance in offshore wind, which is our area of expertise. We are an offshore wind developer, headquartered in Madrid, but with global presence, in 8 different markets. And the project I would like to talk about today is one of the first projects we launched and we proposed. It's still in the development phase, but we believe it's particularly relevant for this debate because it has triggered quite an intense social debate in one of the regions in Europe with the highest traditional strength of nearby movements for any type of infrastructure, which is Catalonia. I would like to give some quick ideas about why public acceptance is so critical and how to handle it in a context which is not necessarily a favorable one for an infrastructure like this one. So on this page, you just have a simulation of the project we are proposing from one of these very touristic beaches, beautiful beaches in Catalonia. Let me check if this can work. No. Yes. Okay, very good. One of the first elements we believe is critical for public acceptance is that the projects proposed need to be of high level of quality. They need to make sense. And the best acid test you need to ask yourself is, what is the opposite of speculation? If a project is good for the environment, is good for the local stakeholders, it has, of course, higher chances of getting public support. And that was the key focus of our effort, even before going public. So we have proposed a project that is off the coast of Catalonia in northeastern Spain, with a target capacity of 500 megawatts, with a subsequent phase of an additional 500 megawatts. And we have proposed this project once we had already conducted quite a number of assessments and detailed studies, so that we were ready to show it to the local stakeholders and answer most, if not all of the questions. So that's a first important aspect, is to have an ambitious and rigorous approach to project development. Second important aspect is that each project needs to address a specific challenge. It needs to answer a specific question. And in this case, that question was pretty obvious, is how to bridge the gap of renewable penetration in Catalonia, which is one of the regions in Europe with the lowest penetration of renewables, to a large extent due to traditional strong opposition to any new infrastructure. I must say that it's a beautiful country, it's a beautiful region, so not surprising that people are very attached to their land and want to protect the landscapes. But the consequence of that, to a large extent, is a penetration of 16% renewable, which is almost half of the average penetration in Europe, and roughly the same proportion compared to the average in Spain. Having said that, the regional government has set very ambitious goals for renewable penetration, with 50% production target by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And it's far from being clear how to get there through different means. So this project doesn't answer the full question, but it's definitely a key element in answering how to get to 100% renewables in Catalonia by 2050. The third element, which is very critical, is to propose projects which are well suited. The Deputy Director General insisted on the importance of not interfering with protected areas. That was very clear for us from the beginning. It's not impossible to develop offshore projects in protected areas, but we wanted to avoid any conflict from that point of view, and our site is located outside those areas. We are, of course, leveraging as much wind resource as possible, and the site is located in one of the windiest areas in Europe, in an area that is technically feasible from a water depth perspective. And very importantly, fishing is, of course, one key activity that we took into account very clearly from the beginning. And we selected a site that was already defined by fishermen as a non-fishing area, an area which is a sanctuary for reproduction of different species of fish. So the first thing we did was to talk to them, and the first feedback we got from them is, if you locate your project here, there's where you're going to have the lowest impact to us. So proposing a project that makes sense is the first critical step to being able to achieve social acceptance. The second important aspect is how to engage with the public. I already commented that you need to be super proactive. You need to arrive early on. We have started a year and a half ago, and still today, we haven't started the permitting process yet. We are having a lot of meetings, more than 200 meetings held so far. We have a webpage. We have all the information available from the project. Everybody can see it, fully transparent. You can have also, I actually encourage you to take a look at our webpage, parcdetramuntana.com. And there, you can have things like visual simulations, which was one of the main concerns in a very touristic area. We were somehow lucky that, in many projects, there was an opposition group that created a visual simulation that was awful, but that was obviously wrong. Turbines are not black. They're not as big as they show here, and there are less turbines that they were reflecting on the simulation. Is the one on the bottom of this slide on the right-hand side. So we built our own simulation with full transparency. The methodology to build the simulation is accessible, and people can verify how it looks like. And here is the picture. You might like it or not, but that's the reality. That's how it's going to look like, and it's fully available to everybody. Third element is to be very close to the terrain, is to beat the track, as we say. We had more than 200 meetings, as I said, with local stakeholders. We've spent a lot of time on the site. Yesterday, we had our team visiting a municipality there. There was another meeting on Saturday. There's another one planned for later this week. And it's a continuous process. And as part of that process, you need to be able and you need to be willing to engage with the opposition groups. So we had more than 6 debates face-to-face with opposition groups because we have nothing to hide. We believe this project makes a lot of sense. We believe it's perfectly integrated in the environment and integrated with the local activities. So being bold and courageous to share views and to exchange views, even with people who oppose the project, is very important. So what's the result of all that activity, which is exhausting, I must admit? Well, the result is that information flow is very important. So it's about informing people, it's about educating people, but it's about listening. Even more important than explaining what you propose is to listen concerns, is to listen to proposals. And we have listened a lot in this case, in such a way that we have been able to improve the project compared to the first versions we proposed, with some changes that don't make the project more profitable, right the opposite. But again, we want to be at the opposite side of speculation. We want to make projects that make sense, that can be integrated. So we have separated the project from the shore, from 10 to 14 kilometers in the closest point. We have reduced the number of turbines. We have, as I said, located the project in a fishing recovery area. We have proposed to bury, to go underground to the interconnection point to the grid. It's expensive, but it's the only way to go in this region. It's impossible to build an overground export cable. We are opening the project to direct investment from neighbors, from local industrials. And we have also proposed a pilot project to test for people to get familiar with offshore wind. This is the first offshore wind project proposed in Spain, I must say. So it's a new technology for everybody. The consequence of all these is also that the support for the project has been growing over time. And here are just some examples of the level of support it has achieved over time. There was a vote in the Climate Commission in the regional parliament in Catalonia, where for the project received the support of 14 votes against just 1 opposing the project. So that was a major success, I must admit, but it's just part of the journey. The president of Catalonia has also supported the project. The regional minister, the national Spanish minister for ecological transition have all expressed their support for the project. And even the city council of Roses, who opposed the project at the beginning, has now nuanced its position and has stated that provided it gives the right benefits to the community, they will eventually support this project. So it's a long journey, and what we can never forget is that at the end of the day, you need the support from the institutions, you need the support from the decision makers. And that's the most difficult part to obtain. But without public support, it's nearly impossible. So that's why this is so important. It's very time consuming, but all these efforts are definitely worth it, provided that when the tender comes, because there's going to be a tender for the lease space in this area, these type of efforts are taken into account. All the developers are pursuing projects in this area, and they're following a very different approach. They're just waiting for the tender to arrive. So one important message to institutions, to politicians is, please take into account all these very important activities, because if you don't, the next developer will not do the same, and the public support will not be there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for this clear presentation on all the measures you have taken to raise public acceptance of a project which is still in the planning phase, of course, and the challenges that you're facing, but also high political support, I gather, from your presentation. I have one small follow-up question. You mentioned you started working on the project 1.5 years ago, and the tender is not yet published, but do you have any idea how long it would take to go through the permit granting, to get the project hit the ground, so to say?
Yeah. So thank you. We have already conducted a big part of that work. We have already conducted site surveys, so that when the moment we are lease the area, we are ready to press the button and submit the environmental impact assessment. So that's another important aspect to take into account in these tenders, is the level of progress that you have achieved, because we will be able to reduce that period I mentioned probably by half because of all the work we have conducted so far.
Thank you, Carlos. Our next speaker is Milou van Moerik from the Netherlands, and she will tell us more about the regional energy strategies in the Netherlands and how the public is being involved in the planning of renewable energy deployment in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to come here today. So I have a few minutes to tell you all the ins and outs about the regional energy strategies in the Netherlands. I hope that the presentation will start in a moment. But let me start by the beginning of the regional energy strategies, which was in 2019. The regional energy strategies are part of the Dutch Climate Agreement, and that's the framework for the climate and energy policies of the Netherlands. And it is made and signed by over 100 stakeholders, including industry, but also different levels of government. And actually, local governments, so municipalities, provinces, and water boards said, well, we want to be in charge of onshore wind and solar energy. I think the national government has done that for many years, so it was very central organized. And they said, well, we can do better because we know much better what happens in the region, what our citizens want. So they found it as their job to contribute in that manner. And that's when we started in 2019 with the regional energy strategies. As mentioned, it is a collaboration between different levels of government, including the national government. But it's a bottom-up process, so municipalities, provinces, and water boards are mainly responsible. They were in charge also for dividing the regions. They came up with 30 regions, some as big as 1 municipality and other as big as a province, which includes 20 plus municipalities, and everything in between. And their main focus is on the national target for large-scale onshore generation of sustainable energy, so wind and solar. And in the Netherlands, that is 35 terawatt hours in 2030. The interesting part of this is that we didn't divide that amount over the 30 regions, but the regions make an offer to contribute to that national target, and I will get in more detail about it in a moment. There were 2 other objectives. One is on the coordination on regional level on sustainable heat and the required regional energy infrastructure. It's, as mentioned, it's a bottom-up process, and at regional level, they have to balance different interests. And the first one, as mentioned, is like the target, 35 terawatt hours, fitting it on the energy infrastructure in the energy system on a very efficient way, because we have issues with the density on the grid at the moment in the Netherlands. The other one, and I think that's one of the main reasons why we are here, is citizens' involvement at local level with regards to wind and solar farms. And the other one is more focused on landscape. And as you know, the Netherlands is quite densely populated and we have limited space, also making sure that there's enough room for these farms available in relation to like housing, for example, and other interests. And it is really up to them to find the perfect balance for the region in that matter. One other thing about the strategy itself, it's actually two things. One is that it's a document that is updated every 2 years. The first document was due in 2021, and they had, in line with what the Deputy DG said, go-to areas, and they become more concrete every year, and they update it every 2 years. And the other thing is that it's mainly a collaboration between governments, grid operators, but also other stakeholders involved. And this is just to illustrate the balance and the different interests that they have at regional level. So, for example, if we look at wind farms, which is very good for the impact on the grid, but has less societal support than, for example, a solar farm. And they're all pluses and minuses for the different options to which they have to choose from. So as mentioned, last year, the first document was ready in 2021, which was very interesting, is that these were analyzed by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. As mentioned, we worked with offers, and all the offers combined jointly became 55 terawatt hours on an offer. So we discussed before with the umbrella organizations for municipalities and provinces, what do we do if we do not reach the target of 35 terawatt hours? But we never realized that we need to discuss, okay, what do we do if we have a major offer? So that's a very different shift than what we expected in 2019. So what the analysis shows is that it's likely that the 35 terawatt hours target will be achieved in 2030, but there's still a lot of bottlenecks, and they're mainly focused on the limited space that we have, and as mentioned, the capacity on the grid. That's a big challenge. And focusing on the public acceptance. So we created a framework with a few guidelines for the regional energy strategies, also focusing on participation, which means both at the political level and civil engagement. What we saw is that these documents were drafted in the COVID period. So there was a big challenge to get civil engagement when everyone is in a lockdown. But we saw good examples, digital examples of to involve as much citizens as possible in the policy making of the regional energy strategies. So we have a few dilemmas I just wanted to pick out from this process. The first one is, I think, how to reach everyone. So what we've noticed, if you do it more on a traditional way, for example, if you have a project or still in the policy making, that a lot of people attend that have more free time, that want to go to the city hall to listen and to engage, but you don't reach, for example, parents with young children at home, or other groups that perhaps do not have very much interest in politics or policies. So one of the challenges is how to involve everyone and how to reach specific groups in that matter. Another one is how to get younger generations involved. So sometimes they cannot even vote, but they have a strong opinion on the regional energy strategies. So in every region in the Netherlands, there is a group active of younger people that also have a seat at the table in this policy making. And we try to arrange that as much as possible because we think it's important that they have a say in it as well. And the last thing, and that's I think the end of my presentation, is that we strive towards local ownership of wind and solar farms by citizens or farmers nearby. So it's both an investment, but it's also a way to participate in the project and to have a say in what is happening. And that's really, we have a long tradition in it, but there are also a lot of challenges to make sure that we reach the target and to organize them to be involved.
Thank you very much, Milou, for these insights into your national strategy to define regional strategies, let's say it like this. This is one of the examples that we actually picked up in our guidance on good practices to speed up permit granting for renewable energy projects. I'm very happy to hear more about it today and to spread the good news how it can work at the regional level to involve citizens in the planning for regional energies, renewable energy, sorry. Just one follow-up question. How long does this process take to define these strategies at the regional level, and have all the provinces or municipalities completed this process already?
It takes a few years. So what we have one deadline, and that is that all the permits need to be ready in the beginning of 2025 to make sure that everything is realized in 2030. But what we see now that this type of collaboration will go on afterwards because the world doesn't stop at 2030. So it's also a long-term way of collaborating with each other. But yeah, so 2025 is a deadline, but that will not stop us then from having these projects. And as mentioned, they become more concrete and concrete with every year.
Thank you. We will now move to our final speaker of this panel, Dragana. You will be showing us an example from Croatia on how to cite renewables in respect of the environment, especially.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, and it's really a pleasure to be here and to discuss really very, very concrete examples. So some of them I haven't heard before, so I hope that our Croatia example will contribute to that, and as well, I would say, share some lessons for Europe across the board. So just a few words on the Nature Conservancy. This is a global organization, as you mentioned in the introduction. It was founded in the United States back in 1951, so actually it has 70 years of tradition, but in Europe we haven't been as active all over this time. We started being active since 2009, but actually are more, let's say, on the ground presence and working on active projects like the one that I will show in Croatia has been going on since 2018. So let's say still a young player in European terms, but actually have a lot of experience from across the world. What's also specific about us is that even though we're a large organization of thousands of people, we actually have about 500 of in-house scientists. So basically we have this in-house capacity that we can go to and rely on when we're actually thinking through the solutions that we propose. What's also interesting about us is that we are thinking about climate and biodiversity crisis in the same time. So today we are talking a lot about climate. We're talking about the energy crisis that has moved us in a space that I think we haven't been before. And talking about go-to areas as someone who's been in the policy sphere in Brussels for the past decade, I think it's really an amazing improvement. But the reality is that member states also have different goals on climate, but also on biodiversity. And as we have the Paris Agreement, hopefully this year we will actually going to have a post-2020 biodiversity framework as well. EU has actually also adopted a biodiversity strategy, which calls for the member states to actually protect 30% of its lands and waters. So it means, in addition to all our climate targets, we need to think about biodiversity targets. We also need to think about where are we going to produce food, how are we going to feed Europe. So there are many competing, I would say, interests in European land, and as Netherlands, I'm sure know, there is very, very little land available. So what we try to do is to really think about what you see now on the screen, climate conservation and communities, and think about how can we bring science, but also local knowledge to find those places and one where actually we can have those, let's say, win-win-win solutions. So climate, as I mentioned, climate targets, conservation, meaning our biodiversity targets, the habitats and the species that we need to preserve, but also communities. And I'm really happy that you both underlined that as well, because what we've really seen is that without communities, firstly, you will have really like a much worse project. If you don't sit, you don't talk to people, you don't listen, you're just like not going to have the same outcome, but also you might have a large opposition. Now, I'm going to move a bit to Southeast Europe. And so I've mentioned that the TNC has been working in Europe for a while, but when we decided to do more on-the-ground work, we said we actually need to go to Southeast Europe first. Why is this the case? The reason is actually hydropower. So today, one renewable energy source we actually haven't mentioned much today, but in the past decade pretty much, we've seen that in this region there has been a lot of interest in hydropower, and in return, there's been a lot of opposition. So what we've also seen as an organization is that while, of course, we need to transition away from coal already and we need to find a more balanced energy system, we've seen that actually solar and wind have been hugely undeveloped in this area. And we've started seeing and anticipating that we're running the same risk of actually, with the need and with now also the incentives for more solar and wind developers are going to have the same issues as the hydro sector has had. And we're basically, it's super difficult to develop any hydro projects in this region at the moment. So we wanted to try to kind of counter that from the get-go and bring our scientific support, but also work with many local experts and partners, including governments, including NGOs, but also including scientific institutions, and to show how this planning can actually be done in advance from the strategic point of view. We teamed up with partners in Croatia, and actually over there is a very interesting expert institution which is called Energy Institute Hydropower. It's a publicly owned institute, so it's kind of a JRC, let's say, of Croatia. So they are specialized in energy, climate, but also biodiversity. And we work with them to build support at the local level and also at the national level with the government, but to really showcase how these things can be done. So they were kind of our local scientific arm who really collected all the necessary data. And then together we worked as well to actually go to this Zadar County that you can see now on the screen. And unfortunately, the map there is very low. So Zadar is a fascinating example because it's a coastal county of Croatia with huge solar and wind potential, but also with half of the area of the county in some sort of protected area. So Croatia is, as you may also know, the country with, I believe, they're competing with Slovenia for the highest share of Natura 2000 sites. So 35–36% of the territory is Natura. Zadar is also one of those areas that is hugely biodiverse, where there's also a lot of interest for both solar and wind. And we wanted to basically see in this particular example, can we really find those win-win solutions to develop renewables, to make sure nature is intact, and to see if there is also support from the community. Now, as in the Netherlands, we were a bit misfortunate to do the project in 2020 as COVID started. So unfortunately, the whole stakeholder engagement was not as detailed as we wanted to. However, we were also as well looking into, how can we do that online? How can we develop tools that engage young people? Can we use what's really fascinating for me, Instagram data, and see where people actually spend time? Where are they taking photos? And what does that tell us actually about certain locations that might be more interested for tourism? So yeah, technology nowadays is fascinating. And we came up with these results, and I'll actually jump to the next slide to show you what the data tells us. So what we see here is that in this one county, that is actually 7% of the territory of whole of Croatia, we can have 1 gigawatt of, let's say, suitable areas for solar and wind, which actually, if you compare it to Croatia's target from the NECP for solar and wind, it's over half of the target. So this was really a showcase to say, this can really work. Obviously, it needs much more detailed stakeholder engagement, and we want to see it kind of now rolling out in other places. So this, after this pilot, we also then worked with our partners on the ground to talk to Croatian government, and we're now actually starting the work on scaling this up at the national level, focusing on solar and for the moment onshore wind, but actually also potentially building up capacity to look into offshore as well, even though we know that this area in particular is tricky, and that tourism and landscape is something that people feel very, very strong about. I'll also just mention one thing that I think is important for further discussion in the context of Europe and Repower EU. What we've learned from Croatia, we basically went to other countries of the region as well. We went to Serbia, we went to North Macedonia, we went to Montenegro, and we see that when we sit at a table with different stakeholders, they all perceive this whole concept of environmental sensitivity, social sensitivity, culture, heritage, all these issues, they take it from their own view. And there's actually no harmonized approach on how we're going to develop go-to zones. And from where we stand, from what we've learned so far, and from seeing this playing out also in the US, in India, and across the world, we really think that this searching for some sort of high-level harmonization at the EU level as we think through the go-to zones is really the next priority. I mentioned this specifically and especially because of that lack of thought for communities, and we see that everyone is immediately focused on, can we get all the energy? Can we get all the data to ensure all the species are covered, all the migratory birds? But that, in the end, we can find ways to address that. What is really difficult to address, what is time-consuming, is the stakeholder engagement and really going to the field, really finding the ways to get to people and then translating that into those maps. So I think that is, to some extent, an afterthought, and that has probably also caused some eyebrows also among the NGO community when we hear overriding public interest or issues like that. That's, I think, something very important not to forget, that sort of involvement then also needs to be included if we're setting the strategic planning and priorities. So I'll pause here and looking forward to discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Dragana. A lot of food for thought also in the context of our discussions on the proposal to set up go-to areas all over Europe. One follow-up question to you as well. When mapping the suitable areas for wind and solar in Zadar, did you mainly focus on the resource potential, the environment sensitivities, or did you also take into account certain distances from housing settlements?
Yeah, so we tried to root that into the legal framework, so we couldn't also address all the specific details of, let's say, noise level and how it's perceived by individual settlements and inhabitants of the county. But we did, so obviously taking into consideration the potentials, all the environmental criteria, and then for issues like that, for instance, we took into consideration necessary buffer zones around major settlements and so on.
Great. We had very interesting insights here from all three panelists. Now I turn to the audience online and here in the room and look at the Slido if we already have some questions coming in. Yes, we do. So the first one I see, will the go-to areas be part of the revised Renewable Energy Directive, or will they only be part of a non-binding guidance document proposed by the Commission? This is, I can answer because it's addressed to the Commission, I think. This is currently up for discussion between the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. They will decide whether this will become part of the legislation, the Renewable Energy Directive. The Commission proposed this to be the case, but at the same time we also issued non-binding guidance, indeed, to already give impetus, because this is something member states can already do. They don't need to wait for new legislation, as our Deputy Director General already mentioned. Then the second question, when you want to speed up involving citizens is crucial, and local ownership is the key. Renewable energy communities are the way to go. Do we have any experience among our panelists on renewable energy communities? Some comments on this topic? No. Yes, you can.
Well, I see there's another question for me later on, but I can just reflect that, I mean, renewable energy communities are for sure a huge part of renewable energy transition, but just looking into the electrification and the future of Europe until 2050, we do think that we need to think also about how do we address those larger challenges. So where do we actually put some large-scale solar and wind that our preliminary scientific work shows it will be unavoidable. So yes, but we need to think about also the more complicated issues.
Yes, renewable energy communities are part of the Renewable Energy Directive. So all member states are putting in place enabling frameworks for these, and one of the ideas behind is, of course, that this also raises public acceptance for renewable energy projects. The next one is again through the Commission, so I will not take it now. Gaining local support is the timely process, time-consuming, I assume. How do we ensure local support when permitting processes are sped up? This is, of course, the key question that we need to answer here, but maybe our panelists have some thoughts how we can, at the same time, speed up and ensure public acceptance. Carlos, you want to?
Yes, as I commented in the case of the project we're developing, it's never too early to start engaging with local communities. So the minute you have a solid project that makes sense, I think it's the right timing to go. But let me insist on the importance of this being part of a whole process that also involves the administration and the rules of the game, because one of the concerns we might have is whether this effort makes sense and is useful and it pays off. At the end of the day, it needs to pay off, otherwise nobody will spend all the big effort which is required for this. So it's so important that, as the European Commission has been defending, that at least 30% of the criteria in any tender is not price-based, it's based on other factors. But those other factors need to be framed in such a way that they can be discriminating among different type of developments, and that they can take into account the work that has already been done, more than promises on future work that will be done in terms of community engagement, because what is in the future cannot be demonstrated and tracked. No?
Yes, tender conditions are of course crucial if you want to steer future project developments, and this is for the member states to design their tenders in the way that to achieve their policy objectives. I also now think of another question I want to ask you, Carlos. You mentioned that you opened for financial participation of citizens for this project. Can you explain more how it would work? Is it already open now?
Yeah. Well, it's not open yet because we don't know if the projects will happen. It depends on what happens with the tender and the subsequent development process. But it somehow links with the concept of energy community. Energy community is perceived as a small, relatively small-scale project. These are big-scale developments. So the challenge is how to ensure that participation in such a bigger scale project. And it's not exactly the same, but opening up the equity, or at least the financing of the project, to local communities that can put even a small part of their savings, a small contribution, with a benefit, of course, I think is very well perceived. It goes beyond the economic benefit that can be achieved. It provides a sense of ownership that I think is very important. So yeah, it includes this type of involvement, contributing either with equity or debt to the project, but it goes well beyond that. It involves creation of local jobs, training, other type of initiatives that can be launched, not specifically related with the project, but with energy transition, decarbonization, that might be promoted by municipalities, even if it's not exactly related with the project. If it's in the same direction, we are keen on collaborating and helping financing this type of initiatives. So it's a broad set of initiatives. It's very important that they come bottom up. It's very tricky and dangerous to propose ideas that you don't know if they're going to work or not. They need to be very specific to the specific location. What works here in Catalonia might not work in Galicia, or in France, or in Italy, in other places where we have projects under development.
Maybe the same question to you, Milou. Is this part of the regional energy strategies, the public participation in concrete projects? Is this foreseen somehow?
Yes, definitely. So we have two phases of participation. First is more on the policy making, and the other one is on the project level, and that is actually required in the Netherlands to do that. And I think that regarding the earlier question, that it is very important, I think, to be, as also shown in Carlos's example, to be transparent upfront, and that people think about the policy making process as well. And that will actually, I hope, speed up the permit process, where in the Netherlands we have formal moments for participation. If everyone is already involved, there shouldn't be any surprise element, for example. So I think in the end it will speed up the process.
I think what we can take away is that it is never too early to involve the public, from what all three of you have been saying. Looking again to the Slido, if we have more questions from the audience. An example from Belgium, I see. In Belgium, citizens' participation by offshore wind energy communities will be obligatory for the new offshore concessions. Does Catalonia consider something similar?
So the answer is yes, at the regional level for the projects that need to be approved by the regional government. But that does not include offshore wind. Offshore wind in Spain is under the responsibility of the central government. And there's no obligation to open the capital to local stakeholders' investment. So in our case, we're doing this on a voluntary basis. We believe it's good. Again, might not be the best from a profitability point of view, but if you want to maximize profitability, you will fail. We believe it's a good idea, and it's, more importantly, a demand. It's been requested by local stakeholders. And that's the very reason why we are considering it, is because we listen, and if it's a demand and it helps this project being perceived as integrated, local, adapted to the local environment, well, it's definitely good for the project.
And I also wanted to ask the three of you, do you see any way to avoid the famous NIMBY, not in my backyard effect? We have heard from Carlos, he presented all the measures that his company already took, but still there is opposition. So is there some idea that you can share how to overcome this phenomenon? Maybe Dragana, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think there was actually one of the questions on the screen going in that direction. I would say partnerships, and I think we've seen that really, for example, in countries like Slovenia or in Finland, in countries where they're so forested that, for instance, developing any wind is going to be very tricky. And we went to the field, we talked to people, and they have many misconceptions, I would even say, around wind power. So to be able to get to them, we need to also find collaborations and people who they trust. And building trust altogether is something that, again, in the region of Southeast Europe is a very pertinent issue. So even if investor comes early, you will be kind of looked at and, you know, what are they doing? What do they want here? What is their interest? So it really takes time to build that. And it takes time to really invest in those relationships, either with local NGOs or community leaders, to find them as well, to, you know, to be the voice of NGOs in some cases, or investors, or just the, let's say, more sustainable development.
Yes, I think, Milou, avoiding this NIMBY effect was one of the motivations behind coming up with the regional energy strategies as well. Have you seen it having an effect already in practice?
Yes, a little bit. I think we're still a bit early in the process to see if it really has effect. I think what is important that we take the time at regional level, but also at national level, why we do this. Why do we need wind and solar energy in our country, especially perhaps in this situation that we are in now, to help understand, although looking at the energy prices, for example, why we need them. That will, I think, help a lot in the process also of the regional energy strategies.
Yeah, in fact, this is also something I wanted to ask Carlos. You have been in so many meetings now, presenting the project and explaining and discussing and listening, most of all, to the views of the public. Do you feel that there is enough information out there on the energy transition, why it is necessary, and so on? What more could be done to enhance the level of knowledge also in the population?
I guess there's never enough information about these. These are complex projects. These are complex issues, and when you work in this sector, you take for granted certain things which are pretty obvious because it's your day-to-day, and you need to be very humble and realize that it's far from being obvious for most of your counterparties, no? So yeah, I think I may repeat many things that have been said. I think many good examples have been shown. I would just add that you need to be conscious about who's your target audience. It's impossible to achieve 100% support for any project. There's always going to be some opposition. That's a reality. The question is, how do you convince the 90% of the people who initially are skeptical, open to listen, and will make a decision at some point in time, or will form an opinion at some point in time? The 10% or 5%, I don't know what's the percentages, that will always oppose. Well, that's it, it's reality. And it's fair. It's people have the right to form their opinion, but our experience is that there's usually a wide range of people who are keen on listening, who initially are skeptical, and then decide. And that's the critical moment. Going through that process and being trustful, being very local, super important. And local, I'm not originally from Catalonia, so I've learned a lot about local culture and so on and so forth. And it's not just about speaking the language, which is different from Spanish, but even in Catalonia, there are very different areas, and people tend to trust the people from their own region and so on and so forth. So engaging with the right people, I think is very important, because that's a way to gain trust. The best comment we received from anybody was one from somebody who's opposing the project, who told us, I oppose this project, I still oppose this project. I believe it's going to happen because at the end of the day it makes sense, but if it happens, I want you to do it, not somebody else, because I trust you. And that was an eye-opener, in the sense that you cannot convince everybody, but if you're doing the right job, even people opposing will recognize the work you have done. And yeah, that's very important.
Thank you. Let's look at the Slido again if there are more incoming questions to our panelists. Two questions to you, Carlos, to the Blue Float CEO. What percentage of the cost of the project is dedicated to make it acceptable to the local population? Can you share any information?
Well, it hasn't been fully defined yet. These are very large projects. So we're talking about 500 megawatt. And although we don't have an exact figure, because first costs of floating wind are going down. So what you might estimate today might be outdated in a couple of years. But we're talking about very large projects, multi-billion projects. So any share of the project that you offer to the local population will always be small compared to the broader picture. So it's not so much about, in the case of offshore wind, maybe solar and onshore wind might be different because it's smaller scale, but it's not so much about what percentage, it's about to whom you are offering this. And it needs to be quite broad. You also need to select people who are really involved in the project somehow. So what is more tricky, more than the volume or the percentage, which again is by definition will be relatively small, it's to whom you're offering this, and of course what are the conditions for that to happen, because this is a business where there are risks, and you cannot ask people to assume the same risks as you're assuming as a developer. No? So that's the tricky part, not so much the volume.
I was also curious, of course, to challenge the three of you on the Commission proposal on the go-to areas. What is your take on it? Will it speed up anything? Will it work in practice? How do you see the rollout? Dragana, do you want to say something on this?
Sure. Well, as I said, our view is to be quite actually supportive of this approach, because we do think it can accelerate renewables if done properly. So I'll just reiterate the previous point that the way go-to zones for renewables are going to be developed really needs to be harmonized across member states, and we will all need to be mobilized as they are being developed to make sure that these processes are really followed through. One issue I can add, and it was mentioned already before, is capacity of local authorities, and what I've seen as well in terms of how they respond to this issue, and who thinks needs to be involved and who thinks doesn't need to be involved. And we've seen, for instance, agricultural forestry sectors don't feeling actually the need even to come to these meetings or to be part of stakeholder engagement. And so those are also some of the very important people and stakeholders and actors that we need to bring to the table when this is done. And I think if that message can come from Brussels in a more structured way, as some sort of, again, guidance or a template on how these areas should be developed and what needs to be taken into account, I think that would be the way to ensure its success.
Yeah, so some form of harmonization, but of course the conditions are also different in each country, as you mentioned. Louis, do you want to comment on the Commission initiatives?
Yes, of course. Well, as we discussed earlier, we're already used to working with go-to areas. I think it also helps the grid operators very much for their investments to have these areas allocated. What is always a bit tricky if you're already working on the bottom-up process, whether it's EU legislation or national legislation, that you don't want to slow them down with new legislation. That's always a risk with that. So we have to make sure that it fits with the bottom-up process of the regional energy strategies.
Carlos?
Yeah, I think the Repower EU initiative is super good. I think it's right on time, right on target. But like many initiatives from the EU, it requires the implementation from national governments. And many times that's where you find the bottlenecks. And at least in the case of Spain, there is a public intention from the government to implement offshore wind. But because of different reasons, things are being delayed. So I think it would be important to understand how these bottlenecks can be addressed. Today, again, I'm not sure it's the case for other member states, but at least in Spain, there is a need for higher human resources in the administration to put in place all this regulation, legislation, and so on and so forth that is needed. So I wonder if there's any way of creating kind of task forces that can move from one country to the other, can be shared by different countries to help the national governments in implementing policies that can inspire themselves on what has worked in other member states. So maybe that's an idea that can be promoted, because many times our counterparties in the administration say, we want to do it, it's necessary, we know we are a little bit late, but we simply don't have the resources to do it. So that's a shame, and we should be able to address it.
Dragana, you want to react to this?
Yeah, because I like to hear these ideas, because it's exactly something that we've been thinking about as well at the Southeast Europe level. Because as I mentioned, we went to Croatia, we work with experts there, we went to Serbia, we went to North Macedonia. We see the same issues, same topics being kind of re-emerged every time. And so basically the project that we're just starting up is to develop what we call informally a center of excellence, but we need to maybe think of a better name, maybe a task force or a SWAT team or whatever it is, but a group of experts that come from different walks of life and who can sit together and figure out the way to crack some of these issues. Again, Southeast Europe is a bit specific because we used to be one country. Today we are 7, but many of the power plants and the transmission system was built in the time of one country. So even if we have engineers or even have biodiversity experts, whoever, they operate in a bit more similar approach and a framework compared to maybe if we compare Spain and France or the Netherlands. But we definitely are thinking about this. We are likely to start it in Southeast Europe, but are already thinking, what sort of approach would be relevant for other countries in Europe where there is a need. And yeah, clearly there is. Thanks.
There are, by the way, if I may, some good examples internationally. The World Bank has created a similar group that works with developing countries in setting up a framework for offshore wind development. That has worked very well in countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Azerbaijan, or Colombia. There's already very good success cases there. So maybe a source of inspiration.
Yes, at the Commission level, we hear this very often, that there is a simple issue with the staffing of permit granting authorities. We have seen some examples of member states using the Recovery and Resilience Facility to hire more staff for the authorities. And there's also technical assistance available for member states to get expertise. But yeah, these are just some examples of what the Commission is doing on this front. One issue that several of you mentioned is the grids and the lack of grids. This is maybe deviating a bit from the public acceptance, but not really, because also grid projects have a lot of issues with public acceptance. Do you see any, or do you have insights from Catalonia? Is this a problem for your plans, the insufficient grid capacity, for instance?
Well, not quite, because given the low penetration of renewables, there is grid available. But you're right, in order to increase penetration, new lines are important, and new lines, high voltage lines, are a typical target of NIMBYism due to the visual impact. No? So I guess this a similar approach needs to be followed. In our case, as commented before, we are planning to go underground from the shore to the substation. That is more expensive, but there's no other way of doing it in our view. The advantage of offshore wind is that in many cases you are able to produce closer to the load centers. So in comparative terms, it probably has lower interconnection issues than other type of renewables at this stage, but they exist, of course, and you need to address them the same way as we commented before.
Milou, you mentioned that the distribution system operators are involved in the regional energy strategies. Is the grid one of the main concerns, or does it orient the choice of the areas where renewables will be developed? And is there also a component of planning the future grid after the adoption of these strategies?
Yeah, so I think it's a good thing that the grid operators are involved. They can see if projects are feasible and if they need adjustments, if it's necessary. They use the regional energy strategies for their investment plans. So there's like always a feedback loop between the plans and the investment plans of the grid operators. So I think that is a good thing. What I see as a risk, perhaps, is that this is a huge problem in the Netherlands. And I mentioned that it's a balance of interest, but this is such a problem that if we are not careful, this dominates the rest of the interest that we have at stake. So I can imagine if this problem gets bigger, that we have to be really careful also to look at other, not only make decisions on the basis of the technology.
Very important thought. Dragana, in your pilot project in Zadar, did you take into account the grid constraints, which are, I think, also very important in Croatia? And is all this potential that you talked about realizable in terms of grid?
Exactly. So since we're working with local experts, they also advise us to take a pretty conservative approach on this. So we were looking at the existing grid infrastructure, but for Zadar, I believe that we haven't projected any new infrastructure, and that's something as kind of a next step to look into. Obviously, now as we're going to look at the national level, that's where we're hoping to have a collaboration with the grid operator as well, and to basically get their data and their advice on how to think about the next level of projects, the next set of go-to zones. So yes, they need to be part of it. Yeah.
Thanks. Let's have another look at the Slido. For Croatia, how much is that 2,000 megawatt power transformed to energy? So how many terawatt hour, and what is the Croatian energy consumption in total? Well, this is very technical, but maybe you have an answer.
So yeah, I can advise you to go to our website and actually Google the Zadar County presentation. We actually have a full technical report, which is really extensive and includes all the data layers. I don't have the terawatt number on the top of my head, but I can tell you that in terms of consumption, it's about a third. The 1 gigawatt that we looked into, the over 1 gigawatt of sustainable new solar and wind is about a third of all Croatian households. So it's definitely a not negligible number, given that we only looked at one county. But yeah, for all technical details, please actually go through the study itself, and don't hesitate to send us feedback as well, because all throughout the process and after the process, we've really been collecting the feedback, as we're very much aware that the process has not been perfect. It's been a first iteration, and already in other countries we are upgrading it and thinking it through. So whoever has a comment or advice, we're really welcome to hearing that. Thanks.
Thank you. I think there were more questions. How to ensure that the good concept of go-to areas will not result in excluding all other areas from being eligible as project sites. I think this has been one experience in France, which there was a public perception that creating go-to areas would automatically mean that the rest of the country is a no-go area. Any reflection on how to avoid this? Maybe Milou?
Yes, definitely. In the Netherlands, we do not exclude other areas, but you always need a permit for your project, so we don't exclude them.
Yeah, in principle, target areas for offshore wind in Spain, which, by the way, have not been approved yet. There's a draft that has been submitted for public consultation, and the approval of the final version is expected end of this year. But it will not imply that other areas cannot be developed. But it's very unlikely that it will happen if they have not been nominated. What is very important is that the maritime special planning, which is what affects the business, I mean, is not a definitive picture. I think it's normal that we prioritize the most suitable areas first, but as more and more experience will be gained on installing and operating these wind farms, most likely other areas will be open in the future for development once it's been validated that the impact on the environment, on fishing and other activities is manageable or is even positive, because I think there could be very positive effects in ecosystems if it's done the right way. So hopefully it's not a fixed picture, it will evolve over time, and that we're not targeting development just once, but several times over a long period of time.
Yes, indeed, this was also the idea in the Commission proposal, to have this as a dynamic process and not once and for all, of course. Then the next, how is the transposition of energy communities coming along in Croatia? Do you know?
A tiny bit. I don't follow it anymore so detailed. I was following it a couple of years ago, so I know there's been a number of legislative updates or regulation that's been brought to enable local energy communities. I know of a couple of them that are kind of coming into place, but I see that also in terms of just setting up those projects and getting them running, it still takes quite a few years. So yeah, the short answer would be it's coming, but it's still slow.
And I saw a third question on the Slido. Is social license the largest barrier to doubling the speed of renewable energy rollout, or are there similarly large policy, workforce and finance obstacles? We already mentioned the workforce, especially in the permit granting authorities. Policy and finance, maybe mentioned a bit less. Carlos, where do you see the biggest obstacles?
I think it's a very, very good question. I think it's important to realize that we have a very important challenge ahead of us in terms of energy policy in the EU. The good news is that we have the solution from a technical point of view. The projects are there to a very large extent. The money is there. There's resources and knowledge, especially in Europe, who's leading the deployment of renewables worldwide. The key bottleneck is, in many cases, permitting and administrative work, which is very much linked with the social license. Many times, not always, delays are caused by the reluctance to get opposition at local level. No? So really the key element, the key bottleneck to address today in the EU is ensuring that permitting regulation allow for unlocking all the huge potential that exists and allow for projects to happen, of course, the right way, with the right guarantees, right protection from the environment, from the local activities, and so on and so forth. But that's, in my view, the key issue to be addressed today.
Okay, let's see, there was more in store, yes. Is the Commission pushing every kilowatt hour counts? Micro hydropower. An EU project estimated that repowering water mills could cover in France the consumption of 1 million homes. Personally, I don't know this estimate. Maybe, yeah, this is an occasion for Dragana to speak a bit about her hydropower experience. You mentioned it is also very challenging in terms of public acceptance in the Western Balkans. Are there any experiences that you can share from that front?
Yes, indeed. So I think for Balkans is probably one of the regions where this will continue to be an important issue in terms of obviously balancing the system as a whole. But I think the next major discussion will be also in the role of actually large-scale hydro and what will happen with some of the proposed big projects that are still on the table. The micro and small hydropower, I think, again, I speak from the Balkan perspective, let's say, has really been, the whole public perception issue is now so bad that I think that, it's very difficult to make projects go forward. The France example, I don't know so much, but we're actually also looking as now, again, under EU nature restoration law and, again, the biodiversity strategy into, what is the current situation with some of those small barriers and how to actually remove them and reconnect ecosystems. So I'm not sure about the future of small hydro. I think there will be, there is for sure, a role to play and look into the system overall. But again, for the Balkan region, the question will be, do we repower the existing plants? Do we build some new ones? How will the system as a whole look like? So yeah, it will. It is definitely something not to neglect in the future.
Yeah, definitely different balances to be, different interests to be balanced here as well, especially for hydropower and small-scale hydropower, maybe even more. To Milou, is there a renewable energy fatigue, more local opposition where already a lot of wind power is installed, or maybe the opposite?
That's a tricky question. I'm not sure if there's like one line saying either way, so I don't think so. What we do know from the analysis of the 30 regions is that there are 10 regions that already developed a lot of mainly wind energy and wind farms, and that the participation process is more embedded there in their policy. So that helps, but I'm not sure. It has to do with many factors, how well arranged groups are that are against wind energy, for example, or solar parks. So it's there are a lot of factors, I think, that contribute. But I wouldn't say that it has to do something with this.
Yesterday I actually heard from Austria that there is kind of the opposite than renewable energy fatigue, that once you have more wind parks, for instance, in a region, people get used to it, and there's less opposition. To Dragana, who's the most difficult in your experience, local communities or other sectors like forestry, farming, environmental groups? That's a nice one.
That, I would say, it really depends on a very local context, and we were discussing how, we need to be very local also when we're looking into some of these issues. So yeah, it depends on the country or a county or even sometimes municipality. And so just an anecdote from last week, I was actually in Bosnia, and we were discussing some of the projects on the ground, and one of the NGO partners said, but no, we need to discuss this with another NGO partner because he's the actual local and he lives 5 kilometers away. So, you know, sometimes it really varies, and it goes back to that question that we need to figure out, you know, who are those people with whom we can collaborate and who has the highest influence in a certain region. But I would say that for the moment, I'm really happy with the understanding for this approach that we have on both the energy side and environment/biodiversity side. So I think there is a realization that there are these perceived competing interests, but that can be resolved, and that these two sectors need to work together. So some of those that were mentioned on the screen were still agriculture and forestry, and I think they are getting there. But I think this is where we need to put more effort to really bring them on board.
And they can be actors of the energy transition and protection of biodiversity, of course, very important actors. Carlos, maybe you want to react to the same question. What are the most difficult partners in your discussions?
Well, again, it's very local, and that's why the local approach is so important. So in the case of Parc Tramontana, we realized that it's more the touristic sector, which is very strong, of course, in this part of the country, that leads the opposition movement. In other projects, it's more fishermen, for example. But you should never assume who's the strongest. You need to go very local. And I would like to reflect on the previous comment that you need to have local partners to help you on that. In our case, forgot to mention, but it's very important, we have a partner called CENER. It's an engineering and project development company. It has a very strong presence in Catalonia, and has been critical in that process of understanding the local environment and understanding who you need to talk to, and so on and so forth. I would say every project, every area is different, and you need to understand what are those different stakeholders, the positioning, and you can only do that by spending a lot of time with them. The initial impression is always superficial. You need to go quite deep.
Yes, it is a long process, I guess, and very context-specific indeed. Let's have a final look. We are almost running out of time, but we have a few minutes more. Some energy communities are not small. 2 Dutch renewable energy communities have a project of 240 million euros. That sounds like maybe an offshore project. Are you aware, Milou, of large energy project, renewable energy community projects in the Netherlands?
Yeah, we have several. I think that the energy corporations in the Netherlands are quite good arranged. They have already a lot of years of experience with this, so they can contribute on a bigger level to wind and solar farms. Yeah.
I guess this is more the case in countries where energy communities have a longer tradition, like Denmark as well. There are quite big projects run by energy communities. And then, again to you, Milou, isn't the aim 50% local ownership?
Yes, that's true. Or we strive towards 50% local ownership, but that's a very typical formulation. But that's true. So in the plans, we see in the regional energy strategies that almost every region mentions this. But we have to see once projects become more concrete if that is possible. But it's definitely an ambition also on regional level to have 50% local ownership. There's also, we defined local ownership. I don't know the exact definition, but it also includes farmers and local investors, not only citizens. And I think when it comes to public acceptance, this is key for public acceptance if there is local ownership of wind and solar projects.
Thank you, Milou, and maybe we can take one or two more. How other sources of renewable energies are considered in the frame of the discussion, e.g. heat, storage, etc., apart from the Dutch regional strategies that demonstrate combination of technologies? We're not apparent. Yeah, heat is, I think, a good topic. Are these considered heat, geothermal, other heat projects in the regional energy strategies?
Yes, it differs per region. So we have these three national objectives for the regional energy strategies, and then it's really up to the regions to define if they want to combine it with, for example, mobility, or we see a lot of energy saving as an objective within the regional energy strategy. So it differs very much per region, and they are free to do so. I think when the regional energy strategies become more mature, because this was just a test also for us to see how this would work, that these strategies will become broader and broader. So they will include much more sectors than now. I think the main focus now is on wind and solar, but in the upcoming years it will broaden definitely.
Okay, before closing, I want to make a final round among our three panelists, and I would like to ask you what surprised you the most in what the other panelists or the audience has shared today. I give you a minute to think. Any volunteer to start and share their experience?
Well, to me, as mentioned, for us, the regional energy strategies are also an experiment, and it's just really nice to see that other countries and organizations are doing the same thing, and I hope that we can learn a lot from each other's experience and that we can facilitate learning from each other, but it's good to see from different perspectives that we're working on the same cause.
Basically what I wanted to say. So no, truly, I think I was just thinking, is it COVID that maybe took us apart in some of these discussions, because both of these examples were new to me, and they really feel so similar and so known, as well as the challenges and the solutions implemented. So I'm happy to hear there's more as well, people, governments, but also investors, so all different stakeholders thinking along the same lines. So yeah, it's wonderful, and hope we'll have more opportunities for this. Thanks for this space to discuss, actually.
Thank you, Carlos.
No, I might repeat what has been said right now, but I fully agree with what has been commented, in the sense that we have shared very similar views about how to address public acceptance. I keep the idea that probably the combination of the three approaches we have seen here from public administration, NGOs and private sector, with the same goals, with the same means and aims, but collaborating among these three different types of institutions is going to be key for success, because that is what's going to build the trust that local stakeholders need to build. If they only hear one party, it's more difficult to gain that trust. But if they hear different parties with different interests applying the same approach, hopefully and most likely, that will drive to success. So I keep the idea of replicating the same approach from different angles, which are all very important for the success of these projects.
Yes, indeed, different stakeholders have to come together to make this work. I hope the audience feels as inspired as our three panelists by today's discussions and insights. And I want to thank you all very much, of course, to have come and share your experience. And I wish you all a nice lunch.